my shade leg.
My talk is called An Ill Wind in Tortuca, or How Creationism, Its Existence and Persistence, tells us a lot about how people think, even when they're not being creationists, and how all this affects the way free thought secularism ought to approach the bigger world. The Tortuca part of this talk involves a new word I'll be defining shortly, but before I get to that, we have to start with a very basic question. How do people believe things that aren't true? I don't think any legitimate philosophical system can get away from that issue. People believe all sorts of things, and some of them are wrong. Unless you're contending that all beliefs are in fact true, and I'm afraid that's a non-starter. It's that mutual contradiction issue, A equal not A in the math jargon. The Earth can't be simultaneously revolving and not revolving around the sun. That's a decidable science proposition for you. Heliocentrism yes, geocentrism no. Whether that Bill Shakespeare guy actually wrote all those plays and sonnets attributed to him is a less obviously decidable historical proposition. If we move on to whether it's a sound idea to sacrifice human hearts to Quetzalcoatl to keep the sun rising, well, that's a religious proposition, but it's also utterly decidable. Heart sacrificing, wrong, and stupid. But when we move to other doctrines, such as whether Jesus Christ was actually the incarnate son of a triune God of Abraham, we're dealing with issues that are undecidable in a way the other three aren't. What that distinction means for the practical debating strategy of secular thinking, I'll be getting back to. So, how do people who believe things that aren't true do that? Are they just being stupid or wicked, to borrow Richard Dawkins's rather smug characterization of anti-evolutionists? As it happens, Dawkins was just on comedian Bill Maher's real-time talk show on HBO. With the popularity of creationism, Maher asked him how people could believe such things. Dawkins reminded Maher that evolution depends on variation, and apparently there was a spectrum of brain variation in human beings, with Sarah Palin at one end and Einstein at the other. It got a big laugh on Maher's, too. But is that actually telling us much? Is faulty belief merely the absence of intelligence? Stupid people believe silly things, bright people don't. Indeed, Dawkins has tried to popularize the term brights to apply to people, like himself of course, who have escaped falling into the quagmire of false belief. As a marketing slogan for free thinking, bright is not only patronizing, I think it's wrong. The ability to believe things that are not true has very little to do with intelligence. To see this, try plotting Isaac Newton on Dawkins's Palin-Einstein index. Where exactly does he fit? Newton is incontrovertibly one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, and simultaneously could believe in all sorts of Bible prophecy claptrap, wacky enough to entertain even the most extreme wing of Sarah Palin's miracle-mongering evangelical subculture. Or take Philip Johnson, the avatar of the modern intelligent design movement. He got into Harvard when he was 16, and yet he's been able to totally doubt the validity of natural evolution. How he manages to do that obviously has less to do with whatever intelligence is supposed to be, and more to do with what it means to believe things in the first place. The first impulse is to notice how Johnson had got God, and came to the conclusion in his nice analytical lawyer way that natural Darwinian evolution, as characterized especially by scientists like Richard Dawkins, represented a threat to traditional religion and therefore had to go. So was all this simply a matter of religious fervor, blinding otherwise bright minds to the light? Like a lot of critics of creationism, I had thought that was all that was going on. That is, until I bumped into Richard Milton. The editor of British Mensa magazine, Milton's 1997 book, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, argued not only that evolutionary theory was unfounded, but that the modern geological system was wrong too. Milton was swallowing, hook, line, and sinker, a litany of young Earth creationist arguments about geochronology, but without any religious motivation. The secular Brit had arrived in YEC land without starting in Genesis. Whatever was going on in his head wasn't about religion. So what was? Well, when you look close at how he constructed his arguments, Milton was assembling his views the same way Philip Johnson was, only paying attention to the parts he wanted to pay attention to. The same was true of everybody else in the anti-evolution biz, from young Earth creationist Dwayne Gish, to old Earth creationist Hugh Ross, to every one of the ID gang at the Discovery Institute, Michael Behe, William Dembski, Jonathan Wells, and so on. The behavioral pattern of over-reliance on secondary scholarship, thinking that reading Smith telling them about Jones could substitute for actually reading Jones, turns out to be a common pathology for everybody who holds positions that aren't true. People read or believe things that other people tell them are so, and then their brains stop. Don't take the next step into finding standards of evidence and casting the net as wide as possible to better determine where the truth might lie. Religion has nothing to do with this failure. It's the method that is their madness. And that is just as true of Eric von Däniken's Ancient Astronauts as it is of Ann Coulter. Just watch the recent National Geographic Channel documentary on the 9/11 conspiracy theorists and you'll see yet another illustration of exactly what I mean. None of these people had hit on some fantastically new way of thinking badly. They all use the same system of bad thinking. All that separates them is what they are thinking badly about. This realization only puts us where people like Michael Shermer already are, recognizing a commonality to faulty belief systems. What it doesn't do is finish the loop. Tell us what might be going on inside the head of somebody when believing things that aren't true, and perhaps even related to broader cognitive processes in the human mind. Which is why I kept being reminded of a scene from a movie. It was Spencer Tracy grilling Frederick March on the Bible in Stanley Kramer's 1960 film version of Inherit the Wind. How many here have seen Inherit the Wind? Yes, not as many as far too many people have not seen that movie. Anyone who comes to Spokane, I'll slip it on the DVD player and be happy to show it to you. For those of you who haven't seen it, it is the fictionalized account of the famous 1925 Scopes anti-evolution monkey trial in Tennessee over their law forbidding the teaching of evolution in public schools. The 1950s play was very much a parable of intolerance in the waning days of the McCarthy era. The Bible-spouting William Jennings Bryan became Matthew Harrison Brady, played by March in the movie, and his secularist opponent Clarence Darrow was Henry Drummond, Tracy's partner. After legal maneuvering prevented Darrow from introducing any scientific witnesses, he pulled one of the great ploys in legal history by calling Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. Unwilling to be pinned down on how long the days of creation were, Brady harumphed, "The Bible says it was a day." Drummond persisted. "Well, was it a normal day, a literal day, a 24-hour day?" Brady hemmed again. "I don't know." Drummond leaned in close. "What do you think?" A long pause followed. "I do not think about things I do not think about." Whereupon Drummond fired back, "Do you ever think about things that you do think about?" It's a good line, isn't it? You could accuse the screenwriters of just setting up a good punchline here, except Bryan and Darrow had actually said those things. And it kept resonating in my head as something that was profoundly true. The Matthew Harrison Bradys of the world really didn't think about things they didn't want to think about, and weren't very good either at thinking about the things they did think about. Isn't that precisely what is going on for all the people who believe things that aren't true? No matter how bright they may be in other ways, no matter how carefully educated they have been, such people are perfectly capable of simply not thinking about whatever it is they don't want to think about. Such people suffer from Matthew Harrison Brady syndrome, MHBS for short, which works really well as an acronym too, MHBS. But MHBS is only part of the story. It has to be applied somewhere, directed at some object of desire. And here is where all that religion and politics enter the picture. The religious belief is what a Philip Johnson or a Dwayne Gish applies their MHBS aptitude to. For the non-religious Richard Milton, it is its scientific mysteries with a capital M. People with similar motivations, but less MHBS, may fall on a different part of the spectrum. There is evidence that there may be a God module, or more likely a variety of them in the brain. If so, President Obama's new director of the NIH, Francis Collins, is a likely candidate. But however strong his spiritual epiphany beneath the waterfall may have been, he apparently isn't nearly high enough on the MHBS side of the graph to overcome what appears to be a quite careful scientific mind. Without any motivational urges and no MHBS to fuel them if there were, you end up with the rarity of people like Arthur C. Clarke or Richard Feynman, insatiably curious minds that strive only to figure out what's actually true and doing their best to figure out precisely how to do that. Which leaves us staring at the upper end of the chart, at those high-incident MHBS minds that have some internal motivations or desires smoldering away. What do we call them? That's the problem. We don't actually have a word for them. That is, until now. The image I had of such people were like turtles, hunkering down under their shell, feet tucked in, able to see only the tunnel vision, reality out the hole, living beneath the carapace, utterly impervious to all the contrary evidence or argument you might lob at them. It simply falls off the shell, no damage done. But I didn't want to call these folk turtles, if only because I might want to discuss turtles and didn't want to generate any confusion. But I didn't want to let go of the image either, so I cast about for a surrogate term, and as it happens, the Latin for turtle is Tortuca, T-O-R-T-U-C-A. Now I had a term that could be applied, imagery and all, without any excess conceptual baggage, except for people who speak Latin, but no matter. A Tortucan is a person possessed of a very strong MHBS, who manifests that trait in the defense of equally powerful belief systems. Their cognitive landscape is riddled with what might be called Tortucan ruts, zones of thought that channel how they perceive and process information relating to the objects of their interest. Not every aspect of their mind would be governed by such ruts, though, which means they could be as reasonable as all get out when dealing with things outside their boundaries. The Tortucan model of the mind frees us from the obligation of seeing faulty belief as an all-or-nothing proposition. Rather than falling on some simplistic Palin-Einstein line of intelligence, any individual human mind can embody both Tortucan and non-Tortucan elements. It was at this stage that a disconcerting realization came to me. In this concept of the Tortucan mind I was building up, there was nothing in principle to preclude the possibility of a highly MHBS intellect mapping onto belief systems that were true. This meant that we had to look far more closely at the thought processes and methods on the opposite side of the fence, atheists versus religionists, secularists versus cultural warriors. It occurred to me that when people have arrived at a correct position, we may be more than likely to overlook logical flaws in their reasoning because we can agree with the end result. That following the logic of mathematics, it is not good enough to merely get the right answer. It is important to have arrived at it through a correct and appropriate line of reasoning. Only by making that methodological distinction can the larger role of the Tortucan mind in the human community be detected and its possible extent measured.